Welcome to the Tim Booker channel, where wisdom deserves to be spread. Wishing you an enjoyable listening experience. Today, I'll be interpreting The Elephant in the Room. The subtitle is Silence and Denial in Everyday Life. So, how should we view the phenomenon of collective silence in life and the insights it brings us? What is collective silence? Collective silence refers to when everyone pretends not to know or see something blatantly obvious and simultaneously keeps their mouths shut. And that's precisely what the title of this book describes, an unusual scenario. Imagine a room with an elephant standing in it, a colossal creature impossible to miss. Yet, everyone in the room avoids talking about it, tiptoes around it, and even gets cornered by the elephant, unable to move freely. Here, the elephant symbolizes those glaringly obvious facts or issues that we simply can't ignore. The author uses this metaphor to describe collective silence. The author of this book is Avietor Zerubbabel, a sociology professor at Rutgers University in the United States. Zerubbabel is, in fact, a Jewish person who grew up in Israel. In his childhood, he noticed that adults around him always avoided sensitive historical issues between Jews and Arabs. This sparked his interest in studying this phenomenon, ultimately leading to the completion of this book. The author believes that the emergence and development of this collective silence are influenced by various factors within a society, such as cultural customs, power structures, interpersonal dynamics, and more. Some forms of collective silence are well-intentioned, like social politeness or sparing someone's feelings. Others may be neutral, making it difficult to morally judge them, such as choosing silence for self-preservation. However, some can have negative impacts on life, with conflicts and flaws becoming so obvious that they hinder normalcy. Yet, some people still choose silence, which is a form of irresponsibility and self-deception. The famous Andersen fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, illustrates this type of situation. Faced with the emperor's foolishness, vanity, and the audacity of the swindlers, most people choose evasion, but it's ultimately a child who speaks the truth. Regarding the phenomenon of collective silence, the author of this book discusses 4 key points. The first point covers the characteristics and elements of this phenomenon, the second explores its causes and development. So, what about the third point? It delves into the consequences of collective silence and the negative impacts it may have on society. Lastly, the fourth point focuses on how we should address and break the cycle of negative collective silence. Now I will explain each point to you one by one. First, let's focus on the first key aspect, the characteristics and elements of the collective silence phenomenon. When we think of silence, most of us initially associate it with not speaking. However, the author believes that mere silence, in the narrow sense, is just one aspect of it. In the true sense, the concept of silence should encompass 3 levels of features: not looking, not listening, and not speaking. In other words, it involves turning a blind eye, a deaf ear, and keeping silent. Often, people don't actually refrain from talking. On the contrary, they frequently engage in diversionary conversations, intentionally making unrelated noises to distract from the elephant in the room. Just as a Western nursery rhyme goes, we can talk about the weather, we can talk about work, we can talk about anything but the elephant in the room. Apart from these 3 features, the author identifies 2 other elements of collective silence: obviousness and collectiveness. What does this mean? Obviousness refers to the fact that this kind of not looking, not listening, and not speaking must be directed at something extremely clear or certain, something that cannot be ignored no matter what. Minor or uncertain matters do not fall within this category. When people remain silent in the face of such glaringly obvious elephants, it's a deliberate choice. Collectiveness, on the other hand, means that every individual sees this thing, yet everyone remains silent, as if this thing doesn't exist at all. If it's just a secret known to a few, it doesn't qualify as collective silence. In the author's view, it's precisely this intentionality and collectiveness that make collective silence so peculiar. The author suggests that collective silence often revolves around topics that can be embarrassing, sensitive, or even fearful, such as defects, violence, scandals, power dynamics, and more. For example, during World War II, many Germans who served the Nazi regime were aware of the fate awaiting the Jews imprisoned in concentration camps, but they went about their jobs obediently, following orders, and never discussing what might be happening in the camps. Similarly, some families may suffer from severe domestic violence, a fact known to the entire neighborhood or community, yet everyone avoids talking about it or offering help to the victim. So far, I've covered some of the characteristics and elements of the collective silence phenomenon. Next, let's move on to the second key point, the author's exploration of the factors contributing to the formation and development of this phenomenon. First, the author believes that collective silence is directly related to the culture and customs of a society. We've all experienced how social culture and customs influence our choice of topics and the direction of our attention. What can be discussed and what cannot are often shaped by the influence of our families, friends, and the broader community, a set of societal taboos. For example, the classic topic of sexuality is rarely discussed proactively by parents and relatives in East Asian households, and even during adolescence, sex education becomes a challenging issue, with everyone avoiding direct conversations. In contrast, in South American and African households, children may have very open discussions about sexuality with their families, and even girls can freely talk about sexual topics. This reflects the influence of different social and cultural traditions. Additionally, some social organizations and groups have their own internal dynamics. For instance, in the American police system, there's a long-standing tradition of not allowing members to disclose internal scandals to the outside world. It's the idea that you shouldn't air your dirty laundry in public, and if you do, you'll be seen as betraying your comrades and face rejection and retaliation from others. Moreover, preserving face and showing courtesy is another form of societal taboo, albeit a milder one. In such cases, collective silence is about masking discomfort or protecting someone's feelings. For example, if someone has a severe stuttering problem, everyone may know, but no one will intentionally discuss it. Similarly, during a meeting, if your boss belches loudly, and everyone hears it, they will all act as if they didn't notice. If someone breaks such social taboos in these situations, they are often perceived as unaware of social conventions, disrupting the default rules of society. In the end, in the story, The Emperor's New Clothes, Anderson cleverly makes a child the first to speak the truth because, in the eyes of adults, we become accustomed to adhering to social taboos and usually refrain from saying things that shouldn't be said. But in the world of children, they have no inhibitions, so it makes perfect sense for a child to point out that the emperor isn't wearing any clothes. Moving on to the second aspect, collective silence is indeed related to the power structures in our society, according to the author. The author believes that our individual attention and expressive boundaries are often greatly influenced by these power structures. In the presence of superiors, there are many things that are difficult or even impossible to say. Therefore, people are forced to remain silent. Going back to the story of The Emperor's New Clothes, it's only when the central character is the emperor that the drama unfolds dramatically. Imagine if an ordinary person were strutting around in public without clothes, they would likely be criticized and sent home promptly. However, when the same ludicrous behavior is exhibited by the all-powerful emperor, the courtiers have no choice but to remain silent. The author suggests that in the formation of collective silence, power can effectively control people's focus and their boundaries of expression. The more significant the power, the more information they have access to, and the more effective their control over the dissemination and sharing of information can be. Orders and directives can be used to control further communication, thereby perpetuating the collective silence. For instance, during World War II, high-ranking Nazi officers were well aware of the plans to exterminate Jews, but they used their authority to prevent lower-ranking soldiers from discussing it openly. Even when it came to ordinary soldiers, they were tasked with minor duties, such as escorting Jewish prisoners onto trains or confiscating their personal belongings. From the perspective of these soldiers, even though the entire situation felt wrong, they hadn't directly participated in the mass killings. Moreover, they were following orders from higher-ups, so they chose to remain silent. Now, let's delve into the third aspect. The author believes that the spread of collective silence is also related to the interactions between individuals. In the author's view, many instances of collective silence can be characterized as collaborative silence. This means that each person has the potential to participate in the collective silence, reinforcing it together and sustaining it. This collaboration forms a collective force. For example, high-ranking Nazi officers used their authority to prohibit lower-ranking officers from discussing the concentration camps, while the lower-ranking officers did their best to cover up the truth from ordinary German residents living near the camps. These surrounding residents knew that something was amiss with the concentration camps, but they turned a blind eye, refraining from inquiring or investigating further. This unspoken understanding, where you don't say, and I won't ask, is a common feature of collective silence. The author emphasizes that this collaborative push doesn't always happen intentionally and often becomes an unconscious phenomenon within a group. When collective silence initially takes hold, the more onlookers who remain silent, the more likely others are to join the silent majority. This unavoidable, subconscious conformity continues to spread collective silence, leading to a peculiar phenomenon. For instance, if there are two criminals committing a crime in a subway car and the people around them choose silence initially, it's highly likely that the entire subway car will collectively remain indifferent. The author believes that it can be challenging to morally condemn the other passengers in the car at times. This is because when there are numerous onlookers, a passenger who notices others' indifference may find it difficult to trust their judgment and feelings. They might think, maybe the situation isn't as serious as I thought. Could it be that I'm overreacting? After this internal turmoil, they may ultimately choose to remain silent. Interestingly, this passenger's wavering can reinforce the judgment in the minds of others that the situation might not be so severe, and each person's silence supports the others, creating a cycle of silence. This is a typical example of how interpersonal interactions affect collective silence. Alright, the above was the second key point I shared with you, which is about the emergence and development of collective silence. Now, let's move on to the third key point and discuss the consequences of this kind of collective silence that we encounter in our lives. The author believes that some forms of collective silence are acceptable. For example, those traditional taboos formed by societal and cultural rules, or the polite silence taken to respect others' feelings, protect their privacy, or avoid awkward situations, can be considered benevolent and worthy of encouragement. However, apart from these cultural taboos and benevolent silences, many other forms of collective silence may not be beneficial. They can be seen as a way to escape from reality in conflicts, sacrificing long-term interests for immediate gains, potentially sowing the seeds of future problems. For instance, silence can lead to cognitive difficulties for individuals, as it involves evading and denying facts. This can make a person's perceptions lack clear evidence-based support, leading them to lose trust in themselves and start doubting what they hear, see, and touch in the world. Prolonged exposure to this eerie feeling can result in significant psychological distress and even be a source of fear. For example, a child growing up in an alcoholic family, returning home every day with their mother to find their father passed out on the floor from excessive drinking. Yet, no one utters a word, and the mother silently cleans the room. The next day, no one brings up the issue again. Over time, the child may become puzzled and begin to wonder if it's all a figment of their imagination. Moreover, silence can lead to a lack of trust among group members, and everyone becomes guarded around each other. Even though everyone knows or has experienced certain things, they intentionally act as if they don't exist. Each person harbors unspoken thoughts, but they limit their communication to a dull and safe realm. Over time, this can lead to the dissolution of group cohesion. The more collective silence an individual experiences, the more prone they become to feeling lonely. Their interactions with others become exhausting, and eventually, they may not even want to share their thoughts with anyone. Furthermore, certain forms of silence can lead to the erosion of societal norms. For instance, turning a blind eye to violence or scandals is essentially an encouragement and tolerance of wrongdoing. It can lead to even greater acts of misconduct and gradually erode people's moral compass. As a famous political saying goes, the most effective way to undermine morals is not to discuss them and to avoid discussing this avoidance. Additionally, the author emphasizes that harmful silence can reflect back on itself. The longer silence persists, the more challenging it becomes to break, and the greater the societal cost in the end. In response to this, Martin Luther King Jr., the American civil rights leader, once cautioned his fellow citizens, saying, "We will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." Alright, the above was the third key point of this book, which focuses on the adverse consequences of collective silence. Next, let's discuss the final key point: how can we correct and break negative collective silence? The author believes that to break such negative silence, the first step is to publicly acknowledge the presence of the elephant in the room. It needs to be spoken about, written about, or demonstrated through actions, and it should be brought into the spotlight to prompt a positive response from everyone. For example, in 1894, a low-ranking French military officer was falsely accused and dismissed from service. At that time, France was steeped in a wave of anti-Semitism, so people turned a blind eye to this case of injustice. Ultimately, it was the prominent writer Émile Zola who published an open letter titled J'accuse, exposing the plight of this Jewish officer and rallying support. This broke the collective silence and awakened the conscience of society. Within a group, when we speak up, the author suggests that we should be straightforward and open with our companions. We should create a culture of addressing issues directly. Of course, a little humor and consideration can go a long way. All silences can be broken with a knowing smile. Furthermore, breaking silence requires the collective effort of the entire social system. Just as the power of a group can reinforce silence, it can also be used to break it. The first person to point out the elephant in the room is just the beginning, others must follow suit. In Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, the child who spoke about the emperor's lack of clothing was the first to do so, but equally important was the fact that his father eventually supported him. People around them also expressed agreement, and ultimately, the entire street joined in, causing the emperor's new clothes, or rather, the elephant, to come crashing down. Lastly, the author believes that it requires courage and patience from each of us. In real life, the reactions to the brave person who breaks the collective silence can vary greatly. Some people may echo their sentiments, some may continue to remain silent, and others may attempt to change the subject and divert attention away. Overall, the person who breaks the silence often becomes the target of exclusion by some, leading to questioning, mockery, or isolation. At such times, our courage and patience become crucial, and we must provide more tolerance, understanding, and protection to the individual who speaks out. Only in this way can the negative forms of collective silence become less prevalent, eventually creating a positive and virtuous cycle around us. Alright, we've covered quite a bit of content today. Let me provide a brief summary of the key points discussed earlier. Firstly, we delved into the characteristics and elements of the phenomenon of collective silence. The author believes that the concept of true silence encompasses 3 levels of features: not looking, not listening, and not speaking. Besides these 3 features, there are 2 other crucial elements: obviousness and collectiveness. Obviousness means that this kind of silence must pertain to something extremely apparent and undeniable, something that cannot be ignored in any way. Collectiveness refers to when everyone sees this thing but simultaneously chooses to remain silent. It's this deliberate and collective aspect that makes the concept of collective silence particularly intriguing. Secondly, we discussed the reasons behind the emergence and development of collective silence. The author believes that collective silence is directly related to the culture, customs, and rules of a society. These societal and cultural norms often create areas of attention and discussion that are off-limits, leading to collective silence. Avoiding awkwardness and demonstrating politeness is also a manifestation of social taboos, albeit a milder one. Furthermore, collective silence is influenced by power structures in our society. In the process of forming collective silence, those in power can effectively control the focus of people's attention and use commands and other coercive means to control the further exchange and sharing of information, thus perpetuating collective silence. Apart from social taboos and power structures, the spread of collective silence is also influenced by people's interactions. Some forms of collective silence can even be described as a cycle of silence. Thirdly, we discussed the impact of collective silence. The author believes that aside from benevolent silences, denying and evading the elephant in the room often doesn't provide us with a sense of security and can, in fact, lead to more problems in the future. For example, it can lead to self-doubt and suspicion regarding one's memory and cognition, reduce trust among group members, harm collective cohesion, foster wrongdoing, and contribute to the erosion of societal moral rules, among other effects. The longer silence persists, the harder it becomes to break, and the greater the cost society pays. Finally, we talked about how to break this negative silence. To end it, we must acknowledge the elephant in the room, bring it into the spotlight, and provoke a positive response from everyone. Additionally, we need to leverage the power of groups to break this silence. For the child in The Emperor's New Clothes, every member should offer more support and understanding. Only in this way can negative forms of collective silence become less prevalent, ultimately creating a virtuous cycle around us. It's about addressing issues at their inception, rather than allowing them to grow into an elephant in the room. Alright, that wraps up today's content. Congratulations on completing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom with practice to achieve our financial goals and create a better future. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.